welcome to the latest in our series of global discussion forums. I'm delighted this morning to welcome Sir John Redwood, about whom I'll speak in a moment. But first of all, this is a co-production between factsforeu.org, cibuk.org, and commandingthenarrative.com from Australia. This is being beamed around the world, and we already have people I can see in the audience from all over. So everyone welcome. And I'm now going to pass you quickly to my colleague in Sydney, Australia, Stephen Tripp, for him to have a few words. Stephen.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for today. I'm very excited to have Sir John Redwood on with us. We know that he's a great intellect and a thought leader. So let's get into it. But before we do, I'll just let everyone know that if you want to be part of this, we'll let you know as we go along and how you can sign up to one of these Zoom meetings. And also, if you're watching us on YouTube and you want to ask a question, you can contribute to the live chat. But other than that, Lee, please take us away. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce everyone as if he needed much introduction, certainly in the UK, but maybe to our global audience, to Sir John Redwood, a former Secretary of State, held many positions within government, known also perhaps as being Margaret Thatcher's single market minister some years ago. I've known him for a few years. He's a leading commentator now on economics and politics, having just stepped down from his seat in the House of Commons in the British Parliament. He's a distinguished fellow of All Souls, Oxford, and a City Strategist. He has business experience, critically. He's been a chairman of 2 international industrial groups, as well as his experience in politics, and also a director of Rothschilds. He pioneered privatisation critically, which no doubt will come up today. And he's written many books, which I can recommend, on economic and political trends. So Sir John is going to give us a brief summary of his thoughts, following which Stephen will throw it open as moderator to questions from the floor. John will then expand on some of his views and answer your questions. So Sir John, welcome and thank you for doing this today. And I'm now going to throw the ball back to Stephen in Sydney, Australia. Stephen.
Thanks, Lee. As I said before, we're very excited to have Sir John on. We're going to hear from him now. Please, Sir John Redwood, take it away.
Well, Lee and Stephen, thank you very much for organising this and welcome everybody around the world. The topic I was given is how do we get faster growth? Most political parties, many governments aim for faster growth. Why do they want that? Well, we want rising living standards. We want more and better paid jobs. And they always want more tax revenue. And the painless way of getting more tax revenue is to have lower tax rates and grow the economy quicker. And then you get more revenue without so much pain or without driving people away who might otherwise be enterprising. So I'm going to give you a brief 5 points, the John Redwood remedy to get from sclerotic growth or no growth to faster growth in 5 pretty straightforward steps. But as I found in politics, it's very difficult finding a government who can align all 5 and believes in them to deliver that growth that they say they want. First thing you need is well-behaved and well-disciplined central banking. And we've just lived through an era of dreadful central banking in the main Western central areas. The Federal Reserve Board, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England put their respective economies through a violent boom-bust cycle. They overdid the easy money, the literal money printing that they undertook as a response to the COVID lockdowns. The initial response was very necessary because the lockdowns were so damaging, but they carried on with it for far too long, depressing interest rates to extremely low levels and buying far too many bonds at ridiculously expensive prices. And they then lurched and realized they'd triggered a big inflation. In each of those 3 main locations, inflation got to around 10% when they all said it was going to be 2%, so bad was their forecasting. And so then we went into an era of high interest rates, a crunch on lending money to people, difficulty for people with mortgages or business loans, and even worse still, and most notably in the United Kingdom, very clumsy disposal of the bonds they paid too much for at very low prices. Bank of England wading into the market to take huge losses and sending those bills to the taxpayer. That is exactly the kind of central banking you don't want. The central banks, of course, had a ready alibi. They said, oh, well, it was the Ukraine war with the impact it had on oil and gas prices and on food prices, to which my answer is, well, then why did Chinese inflation, Japanese inflation, and Swiss inflation stay at around 2%? Because all three of those economies are very big importers of fossil fuels and food, whereas it got to 10%, around 10% in the three major ones I've been criticizing. And the reason, of course, is they follow very different monetary policies, and they didn't go crazy printing lots of extra money, keeping interest rates too low, and paying silly prices for bonds. So please, let's have rational central banks who understand that controlling money matters a lot. If you don't have enough of it, you have a recession. If you have too much of it, you have an inflation. Why can't they do a little bit of arithmetic? Sensible thing you need for growth is decent fiscal policies, getting budgets that make sense. You don't want to starve decent public services. You want to properly finance the services you intend to supply free at the point of use. In Britain, people are very keen on free at the point of use healthcare and very keen on free education. So make a good job of them, put enough money in, but you need to control the tentacles of the state, because taking the United Kingdom as an example of current bad management, in the last year, a largely nationalised railway took £33 billion of taxpayers' money to pay all its losses and to put capital into projects that will probably never make a profit. You can't afford that kind of thing if you want to go for growth. The market is a much better allocator of capital than the state is, and it will put the capital to uses where you do create the jobs because they can sell products and services that people want to buy at sensible prices. And in Britain, as a result of the COVID lockdowns, we had a productivity collapse in the public services. Some of the rest of you may have experienced a bit of that in your economies as well. Our officials very kindly made the mistake of measuring it for us. We actually lost 6.5% of productivity in 3 years as a result of the lockdowns, and we still haven't recaptured it. Even the Treasury admits that was a 20 billion hit. I think it's actually a 30 billion hit. You need to have properly managed governments, decently managed public services. You don't need as many officials as they often recruit, and you certainly don't need as many regulations as they pour out on top of us. Third thing is back the digital revolution. You know, what is creating the growth? What are the success stories? Well, the success stories are the American giants, because they are supplying the services and the products for the digital revolution that people want. This is a bottom-up revolution. You don't have to subsidize people to buy an iPad or a mobile phone. You don't have to tax people out of the older technology of sending people letters or keeping written files. People do the transition because they want to do the transition, because these new gizmos provide people with all these wonderful extra facilities. That's why we can have a round-the-world conference at very low cost, thanks to the excellent organisation of Lee and Stephen, because so many people have got the smartphones and the pads and all the other things that you need to do this. So back the digital revolution. We already see some of the losing areas, European Union, for example, not getting the success stories that America has got, seeming to be a bit jealous and then trying to over-regulate. And the dangers of that kind of response is you deny some of that digital growth to your own economies, and you drive even more of it offshore, or it even bypasses you altogether if the regulations get too intense. So governments welcome the digital revolution. And the good news is that the things we don't like about digital, if it allows hate speech or it allows people to organise criminal events and so forth, those are already illegal, and it's an enforcement and prosecution issue. You don't need to use that as an excuse to change everything else and control free speech. Fourth thing is be sceptical about the way the government is handling the so-called green revolution. Because unlike the digital revolution, bottom-up, driven by exciting, innovative, competitive companies, the green revolution is top-down, driven by governments, and pioneered on the back of huge regulations, subsidies, bans, and taxes on the things they don't like. This is not a winning formula if you want growth. The only way you can have a green revolution that will work is if the green revolutionaries design products and services that people want to buy for themselves and can afford to buy. And the green revolution is very contradictory in its own terms. I've been a strong critic in the United Kingdom of the idea that we shouldn't get any more of our own oil and gas out in order to contribute to reducing CO2, because far from cutting world CO2, that increases world CO2, because it means that instead of having our own gas down a pipe, we import LNG with all that extra energy that has to be used to liquefy it, to transport it, and then to regasify it, so it's 3 or 4 times as much CO2. So the policy doesn't work in its own terms. Or similarly, using regulations, bans, taxes and subsidies to make more people buy electric cars before you have a grid which has plenty of renewable energy. So if I went out and bought an electric car today, which I'm not about to do, and I brought it home to charge it, I'd be plugging into a gas-fired power station, because there wouldn't be suddenly extra wind farm energy available to power my cars. Well, what is the point of that, governments? Don't be so stupid. Let the market decide what are the green products and how people want to buy them. The West as a whole, particularly the EU and the UK, is overdoing its response. It's actually increasing world CO2 in many cases by its response. And above all, it's driving the success of the Chinese economy. Because yes, there are more green jobs, making batteries and making solar panels, and making heat pumps. But where are those jobs, ladies and gentlemen? They're mainly in China, and we end up importing. And then the fifth thing we need to do is we need to lower taxes. There is a very good fit between those countries and territories that have the courage to have low taxes or no taxes on enterprise, work, innovation, investment, savings, and high growth rates. And there's equally good correlation between the more communist or socialist states that go in for higher taxes, bans, restrictions, and you find you don't get the growth. They fall further and further behind the living standards of the successful lower tax economies. And one of the contrasts I make, trying to get the United Kingdom to have a more competitive corporation tax rate on business, is between ourselves and the Republic of Ireland, our near neighbours. The Republic of Ireland went for a long time for a 12.5% tax rate. The UK now goes for a 25% tax rate. And who raises the more revenue per head? Well, by a country mile, the Republic of Ireland raises more corporate revenue per head. Of course it does, because more people set up there, generate their profits there, place the money through the books there. So my conclusion, 5 simple things that government should be doing: good central banking, sensible fiscal policies with a properly controlled state sector, backing the digital revolution, trying to get some sense into the green revolution, and having lower taxes. And you can sum it all up in the need to bring people into the capital process. We want everyone, or as many people as possible, to be owners, to be savers, to have a share, so that they've got something in capitalism, because capitalism is the system which allows you to become a homeowner, allows you to set up your own business, allows you to become a business owner, allows you to have shares in other businesses, allows you to have pension savings. We need to engage more people, help more people, get more people into the wider ownership movement, and then you will have both a happier society and faster growth.
Thank you very much, Sir John Redwood. That was fantastic, and I can't wait to get into it and start picking apart your 5 points there. We are relying on technology here, so just a couple of technical issues before we get started. This one's for you, Lee. Since you're commanding the live stream there, can you just go back to speaker view on the YouTube? It's been changed to gallery view, so if you can just quickly change that back, please. And also, Sir John, are you using a microphone that's plugged into your iPad? Because you're getting
I'm using microphone on the pad.
Yeah, just getting a little bit of crackling there, but it's not that bad, so we'll carry on. I'm already getting some questions in on the YouTube chat, so I might hit one just quickly. SJB is from Jamaica, which, I mean, this is truly a global forum, so welcome SJB all the way from Jamaica. How can you have growth with net zero policies?
Well, as I've been explaining, if you have the wrong sort of net zero policies, they will be anti-growth, and too many of them are. For example, if you try to have a very fast transition from most people driving petrol and diesel cars to forcing electric cars on people which they don't want or they can't afford, you may just simply damage your own motor industry, because it becomes a hostile environment for making the cars and selling the cars that people do actually want, and it will transfer somewhere else. You notice already how the electric car movement is a massive impediment to free trade, because we've now got a situation where China foresaw all this and gobbled up all of the important components for making a battery, got control over or access to crucial world resources in rare earths and important minerals, and put in the capacity to make these things. So China can now sell a battery electric car for maybe half the price or less of the ones that the Western manufacturers are beginning to produce. And so the big areas, the European Union and the United States, and now Canada, have decided they have to impose very high tariffs. Indeed, Canada and USA have imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese cars, because otherwise they think that Chinese vehicles would just take the market and would be extremely damaging to their own industries. Tariffs are not good. They restrict trade, they put prices up, they're not friendly to the customer. But you can see why they've had to do it, because the competitive threat from China, which they claim is heavily subsidized, is so extreme, and so it would be anti-growth. It would be very damaging to those economies if they didn't do something to protect themselves. So my answer is there are quite a few net zero policies that are extremely damaging, and the sooner governments reverse them, the better.
Okay, so we've got a number of people on the Zoom call. If you want to be part of that, you need to be a subscriber at either cibuk.org, factsforeu.org, or commandingthenarrative.com. Please head to one of those websites, or all three, and sign up to the mailing list, and you'll get an invitation to be on this Zoom call, to be able to ask our great speakers and guests a question, just like Graham has done. Graham Gist, you've got a question for Sir John? We'll just have to get you off mute first, mate.
Still on mute.
Yeah.
There I am boasting about running a tech support company in my past, but there we go. So John, that's an excellent summary. You hit the high spots, 5 key points, and can I say an inspiring delivery, which we just don't see very much these days in politics. It's all so drab. But can I take you back? Your first point was central banking. And can I take you back to the events of 2008, which to me are kind of the predecessor of all that? And Gordon Brown and his whole idea of bailing out the moral hazard and getting all the bankers happy. And nobody got kind of punished for what happened in 2008 with the American bankers getting very rich, and hardly anyone was brought to justice. And to me, let alone that injustice, in my mind, I think kind of wrecked the world's economies, and it's put people in the mind where they're much happier to do this COVID thing you're talking about and the bailout. And so I've got a few. Have you got some any background about 2008? And also, do you think we can get out of this mindset of just printing more money?
Well, indeed, you're right to raise the issue of the Western collapse in 2008-9, because it brought in a decade of much slower growth than the decade that had preceded it, and it reflected bad central banking as well as bad commercial banking at the time. And I think people did decide that the commercial bankers had behaved badly, they got a bad reputation, and the regulators moved in a very firm way after that crisis and made them hold much more capital to be more cautious and more prudent, which is one of the reasons we had slower growth. But it was very important that regulators upped the capital requirements after 2008-9 because the main point that led to the collapse was that these commercial banks had been allowed to operate with very small amounts of capital relative to the big loan books they'd built up. And when the authorities then decided to rein that in, they left it far too late. It was, of course, deeply damaging. But I think I blame the central banks as much or more than I blame the commercial banks because the central banks could see all this happening. They saw excessive activity in derivatives. They saw the build-up of colossal amount of loan liability in the system as a whole. And they kept saying, no, that's fine. They said, we've got a new global model. We're much better at managing risk these days. It was very old-fashioned to impose these high requirements for cash and capital on these banks in the past. They can operate perfectly well because they've got risk balanced all around the world. Well, that was, of course, completely untrue. A few of us were very critical at the time and said, you're overdoing this. You, the central bank, are allowing a massive bubble to build up in financial assets and allowing excessive monetary growth. They left it too late to correct, and so we had a boom-bust cycle then on heroic scale. So don't ignore the fact that that was bad central banking, as well as foolish conduct by quite a lot of commercial banks who took advantage of the freedoms the central bank suddenly allowed them.
Okay, well, let's go to our chairman, very hardworking man. I don't know how you do it, Lee, but Lee, you've got a question?
I'd just like to follow up on the city points that Sir John was making. I wonder if you've got any comments. We spent a great deal of time looking at official data for our reports. This official data comes from the Bank of England, His Majesty's Treasury, beg your pardon, the Office for Budget Responsibility, and more globally, we've got the IMF and the OECD, amongst others, and the World Bank, etc., who are all playing quite a significant role these days. This really involves devolving power from governments to unelected bodies. And from our experience over the years of looking at this data and these forecasts, they are drastically wrong. In fact, we almost look at them with a view to this is what's not going to happen. And I wonder if you want to comment on the competence, perhaps you may not want to comment on that, but certainly on whether it's desirable for governments to hand more and more responsibility to unelected bodies. Thank you.
No, I agree with your implied criticism, and I've been making this public criticism on many occasions. More importantly, I've often, at the time they made the original forecast, said, I don't believe that forecast. It's very likely to prove wrong. And it's been all too easy to be on the better side of the forecast from these official bodies. And I was particularly critical of the forecasts made by the international bodies, by the OBR and by the Bank of England over the COVID money printing episode, because they were forecasting that inflation would stay down at 2% throughout. And then, of course, it shot up, and they then blamed the Ukraine war. I've already said that I don't believe that explanation because you didn't get the same big inflation in other world economies that followed a different monetary policy. But there's another crucial argument to rebut the Bank of England and the Treasury over that, and that was that the UK inflation was already almost 3 times target before Putin invaded Ukraine, because they've been printing so much money. It first of all went into financial assets. Nobody seems to mind an inflation in financial assets because people who own them are obviously very happy that they've gone up in value, and people who don't own them don't really worry about it very much. And then, of course, the inflation started to spill out of financial assets into goods and services because people started taking profits on their extraordinarily well-performing financial assets, and then there wasn't enough supply. in goods and services markets. So you started to get the inflation. So yes, bad inflation forecasting means how can a central bank have a proper monetary policy? Because if it doesn't know what's going to happen next, it's got no basis for making adjustments to the interest rates in any way that could be at all reliable. And we've also seen the IMF, particularly in its treatment of the UK economy, often underestimating the strength and success of the economy because it seemed to be hung up about Brexit. Whereas I and others who campaigned strongly for Brexit said this was about freeing our country to make our own decisions. It wasn't about trade, and it wasn't going to have much impact on those kind of things unless we took advantage of the freedoms, in which case we'd be better off. As it turned out, our government was pretty reluctant to take advantage of the freedoms. That's still something to come if we ever manage to elect a government that does want to use those economic freedoms in the way I described in my 5 points.
Graham, you've got another question, mate?
Yes, and hopefully my final one, I just want to follow up on the finance while we're in that conversation before moving on to Sir John's other points. There's a couple of things. Firstly, there was the Glass-Steagall Act being repealed in the States, which I think everybody realizes allowed the commercial banks to start operating in areas of derivatives and stuff that they were previously forbidden to do so for, I would say, good reason. And as you say, Sir John, the regulators over there are trying to impose more capital even now, and that's being heavily resisted by the major banks, including Jamie Dimon's operation and so on. I just feel some of this must be politically driven rather than purely central banking issues. And I wondered whether you have a view on that, because I realize it's into American financial politics, which may not be your particular speciality, but I thought perhaps you'd have an international view of that.
Well, I don't believe you can have a truly independent central bank in a democracy. In practice, electors regard the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom as being responsible for delivering a good economic outcome. And if the central bank has made a mess, particularly if it makes a mess of inflation, the incumbent politicians discover that they do indeed have to take responsibility, even though they could argue, well, of course, that was an independent central bank that made a big mistake. The American system is a bit different from the United Kingdom one, and the American system, very wisely, in my view, charges the Federal Reserve Board with twin objectives, not just 2% inflation, but also maximising jobs and output. So they have to balance two difficult issues, and that gives them a bit more freedom. And if they use that intelligently, then they can abate any downturn to curb inflation because they've got the employment argument that they can use, and vice versa when the economy is going the other way. The Bank of England is only given a single target, 2% inflation, and what a mess it's made in the last 3 or 4 years of that. But the Bank of England was never made independent by Gordon Brown when he made changes as Chancellor in the then new Labour government. Indeed, I think the governor of the Bank of England at that point was thinking of resigning, because whilst the Bank of England was given sole power to set the short-term interest rate, the base rate, which they'd had to consult the government on before, they lost practically every other power a central bank needed to do its job. They had the regulation of the 4 or 5 top commercial banks taken away from them, absolutely crucial power if you wish to control money supply and inflation, and that was put into a different regulatory body, which then spent years battling the Bank of England over their different responsibilities, and it lost its leading role in government debt. And again, the management of the government debt market is a very critical part of controlling so-called safe assets in the system and the expansion or contraction of people's balance sheets. So you have to first of all know what the constitutional position is. Many of my former colleagues in Parliament had no idea how the Bank of England was actually constituted. And when it came to the big quantitative easing programs, the money printing and bond buying, in the United Kingdom, it was always very clear that that was a joint control policy, because when they first started doing it, the Bank of England was so worried about what it was going to do to its balance sheet, because the bonds and the liabilities were going to be placed on its balance sheet, that they demanded a full indemnity by the government and a full sign-off of the policy by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And so from the first Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer to do that in response to the banking crash, through to Mr Sunak doing it on a grand scale to see us through the COVID lockdowns and beyond, the government had to own and consent to that policy. I then found it impossible to get chancellors to understand that if they were responsible for the buying of the bonds and the underlying policy, and if they're still responsible with taxpayers for meeting all the losses, they should now take an intelligent interest in how you unwind this thing, because the unwinding in Britain is particularly clumsy. It's resulting in huge losses for taxpayers and means that the public budgets look so much worse than they need to, because since they turned from making profits on the bonds to making losses about 18 months or so ago, they have sent the taxpayer a colossal bill for £75 billion of losses, which has to come out of the public accounts. So we need to be realistic and understand that these bodies have a big impact on the nation's balance sheet and on the nation's economic outturn. So, of course, what they do is highly political. Indeed, in the United Kingdom, the bank politicised itself, because over the very important referendum campaign on whether we should remain in or leave the European Union, a highly political subject which you'd have thought the bank would have kept out of, the bank very clearly sided with the Remain side and duly lost and upset more than half the country.
So this is a global forum. So if you are listening to this and you're not aware of Sir John because you're not living in the UK and you like what he's having to say here tonight, you can head to his website, johnredwoodsdiary.com, and keep up to date with everything that Sir John is doing. But we do have another question on the YouTube chat from SJB from Jamaica. And it's in relation to net zero. Who is going to set up a business in the UK if blackouts are a regular built-in feature of the grid?
Well, were we to get to that stage, then it would obviously be a big disadvantage, wouldn't it? We are assured by the government and the authorities they're not going to get to that stage. We are, of course, able to import quite a lot of power, and we seem to be on an import-first model in many cases. So I think the idea is that when we have bad wind and solar days, there will be plenty of imported electricity. They need to make sure that is true.
I'm going to, I know Howard's there, but I might jump in with a question of my own, because it seems, as Lee said, Western countries are facing very, very similar problems at the moment, whether it be immigration or net zero policies or just pure economic policies. What can these Western politicians learn from the recent UK general election?
Well, I think what they should learn is that the two main parties in a two-party system can both make themselves very unpopular, and people will then either stay at home or they will vote for new or alternative parties. Indeed, it's a phenomenon we've seen for many years on the continent of Europe, where the old Social Democrats and the old Christian Democrats have in most countries been more or less destroyed as the main political forces in their respective country. It was easier there with proportional representation systems. But what people in the world need to understand is that the Labour government that's just been elected with a very large parliamentary majority got 3 million less votes than the losing Labour Party did in the previous election with Mr Corbyn as leader. It only commanded 34% support of those voting. Voter turnout overall was well down. And so it meant that only 1/5 of the United Kingdom electorate actually went and voted for the Labour government. So it's the unloved landslide government, and it's already in the latest polling quite a bit down on where it was on its pretty unpopular polling result. In the general election, the only reason it got a landslide was the Conservative incumbent government had made itself even more unpopular, and the Conservatives managed to pull off the feat of halving their vote. And most of those people either stayed at home, because they certainly didn't want a Labour government, or they voted for the relatively new party called Reform, which went to 14%, taking a big chunk of what had been the Conservative vote. And we're probably about to see something similar in the German regional elections today, where the polling shows a dire position for Chancellor Scholz's SPD party, the leading party of government, and it's around 5 or 6% in the polls for those two important regional elections, with very high ratings for the Alternative for Deutschland, which is the anti-immigration party, and considerably enhanced voting pattern probably for the Christian Democrats, who are at last reviving, having suffered from a previous bout of electoral anger. So I think you're going to see more and more frustrated electorates around the world not liking some of the policies that they're being delivered by a group they see as a global elite. And so it's very fertile territory for alternative parties, challenger parties for new politics.
Okay, we've got a question from Howard Thompson. Howard, you've been waiting patiently. You have a question for Sir John.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. What more can we do to encourage an interest in numeracy? Rishi Sunak mentioned it recently, and he was almost immediately ridiculed in terms of people should be mathematicians. I'm just reading a report from King's College London saying only about 20%, more than half the working age population has the numeracy level expected of a primary school child. And my experience of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in terms of the ERM fiasco, I could see coming that it was with German unification and inflation, we were going to have to leave the exchange, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister couldn't. What can we do to encourage numeracy as an important factor in the future?
Well, I'm not sure that it was a numeracy problem that they stuck with the exchange rate mechanism. I was one of the lonely minority within government saying this was an extremely bad idea and it wouldn't work. I had taken the precaution of explaining in print before I joined the government why it wouldn't work. And I think it was just political ideology. The European ideology was extremely powerful in the United Kingdom amongst the political elites of all parties. And they were prepared to inflict quite a lot of damage to try and make it work. And of course, it was never going to, because it was fundamentally flawed in ways that we talked about at the time. But your wider point, how do we encourage numeracy? Because I agree with you, it is very important. Well, there are limits to what government can do, but government can promote more numeracy lessons in schools, set targets, invite the teaching profession to take it very seriously and to be more successful. And indeed, that is one of the successes of the outgoing Conservative government. And we all know the mistakes it made, and it paid a heavy price for the mistakes. It did have some great successes. And it did help supervise a big increase in numeracy and literacy amongst our school children. And we did go up the rankings, the world rankings, quite a lot by concentrating on those basics, making sure that children learnt their times tables and that they were tested to make sure they had mastered their times tables before they left primary school. And I see that there are now forces within our teaching unions in the United Kingdom that doesn't like all that and thinks it would be a good idea if we downplayed the tables. I do hope they don't change that. I think that was a really good reform. But we can all do something about it because we are concerned members of local communities, we're in businesses, we're in clubs, we may work in collaboration with schools, we may be parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles or whatever. So it's up to all of us, isn't it, to enthuse our young people with the importance and the interest of numbers. We've got to make it more exciting for them. If people think it's difficult and not very interesting, you won't engage them. So we have to find ways of making numbers interesting. So with the boys in particular, I think you probably get them very interested in goal averages and football statistics and equivalent for the girls. And then it becomes more fun.
It reminds me of my year 11 deputy principal. He was my mathematics teacher, and he used to say, "Don't you go to bed at night dreaming about mathematics?" And no one in the classroom will put their hand up. But on to probably more...
but if you play darts, you've got to know about those doubles and trebles. And if you get a wage check, you need to know about the tax deductions. That's when mathematics becomes important to everybody.
That's exactly right. And they probably should be teaching kids more about taxation and those sort of things in the classroom. But on to another big issue, and this is an issue that we're dealing with in Australia as well, or we have dealt with it in the past in a big way. It continually pops up. This is a question from Steve Renton in the chat. He says, how would you stop the small boats across the channel?
Well, we've had long debates about this, and the outgoing government had the idea of offshoring and the Rwanda plan. I and others warned them that they would need to make bigger changes in the legal position if they were going to get close to guaranteeing that it would work. And unfortunately, they didn't make those changes in time. And now, of course, the new government has scrapped the Rwanda plan. The Rwanda plan did, at the margin, start to have an impact because people thought, we don't really want to go to all the trouble of crossing the channel by an illegal and dangerous and costly route and then discover we might be sent off to somewhere else. And so they were then diverting where they were going to go to, but that has now been scrapped. So the new government says that it's going to do it by a much more effective crackdown on the people traffickers and the boat organisers. Well, you could do it that way. The new government will discover that the old government tried very hard to do it that way. It's not a novel idea, and they've spent a lot of money trying to collaborate with the French police. They claim that that did intercept at least half of the potential boats, and that what we saw was the result of partial enforcement of the scheme. Let's see if the new government can come up with a better way of enforcing the scheme. But it is extraordinary, isn't it, that with all the resources at the command of the British and French authorities, so many of these boats still make their crossings because they must be breaking so many laws. I'm sure they're money laundering. I'm sure they're not paying any taxes on the profits. Why can't we trace the money more accurately? Why can't we have more mystery shoppers trying to get in contact to see whether they can get a seat on one of these boats so they get more of the details of where and when and how the money is paid? Why isn't the surveillance of the beaches leading to more effective treatment so that you could simply puncture the rubber boats before they started to leave, or you could confiscate them, or you could arrest the people when they turn up to try and use them? And there are lots of ways that are feasible. So I wish the new government every success in its wish to enforce these things. There are a few ideas on how you might do it.
Why do you think a lot of the major parties, the two in the UK, here in Australia as well, it seems to be the same theme, why do you think they're so supportive of immigration or large immigration?
Well, the outgoing Conservative government was pledged to cut total immigration, and it failed on a huge scale. It claims that there were special factors, and I think we all agree we needed to be decent to what we hope are short-term refugees from Ukraine, because we hope there will be peace and they can return to their country. And we did need to make a special offer to Hong Kong citizens when things got worse for them under China. But that doesn't account for a very large amount of the numbers that came in. And I think what we saw was that there is an official treasury orthodoxy in the United Kingdom amongst the people who design the OBR models and the people who offer advice to the Chancellor, which seem to think that inviting in more migrants added to growth. Well, of course, if you invite in lots of migrants to do low-paid jobs, and those are additional jobs, then there is growth by the value of that job. But it doesn't increase per capita growth. It actually lowers per capita growth because they were inviting in a lot of people at the lower end of the income scale and skill level. And what they ignored were two things, I think. They ignored the huge pressure that placed on public budgets, because many of these people in very low-paid jobs needed heavily subsidized housing, and we didn't have a lot of extra housing, so you needed to go off and try and build extra social housing at huge expense. And they needed top-ups to their incomes from the benefit system. They also, of course, immediately gained entitlement to free healthcare and free education if they had children and so forth. So there was a huge public expenditure pressure and cost, which the Treasury officials ignored. And it was only towards the end of the Conservative period in office that I and others managed to persuade the senior ministers that we were letting the public down, we were letting the country down, we were letting the migrants down, because we weren't able to supply sufficient good accommodation and public service to meet all their demands. That the government did then make some very important adjustments to the criteria. And the recent figures show quite a sharp fall in the rate of legal migration coming into Britain because of the changes they made. But they didn't make enough changes, and they didn't make them early enough. And we now wait to see whether the new government will simply reverse that.
Now, for everyone that's watching, whether you're on the Zoom call or on the YouTube, now is your time to ask Sir John a question. This is an incredible opportunity to pick his brain and his intellect and his experience as well. So please don't be shy. Put your hand up if you want to ask a question, or if you're on the chat, ask a question. But I'm going to take the opportunity now because, Sir John, you were in the British Parliament from 1987 till just recently. That's 37 years, which is an incredible amount of time. A lot of experience comes along with that. Here in Australia, especially people on the right side of politics are disillusioned with the major party, which is the Liberal Party, the equivalent of your Conservative Party. And a lot of other minor parties have popped up, and a lot of people put their hands up for those minor parties, and really they just chew people up and spit people out, and they're not really effective at all. A lot of people have that instinct of just being a candidate, and putting their hand up for Parliament is the best way to change things. But I'm finding that's not the case. I'm finding other ventures are very effective in swaying the political argument, whether it's forming lobby groups or emailing politicians directly or starting petitions, whatever it might be. In your experience of being in Parliament, what is some effective ways that everyday people can change the political landscape?
Well, I think you're a marvelous example of what people can do without running for elected office. And we need both sorts of people. We need some good people to run for elected office. But we need plenty of people to support them, back them, criticize them, press them to do better. And as you rightly say, there are many ways of doing it. Thanks to the wonderful digital revolution, we don't just have to take top-down media anymore. We can generate our own media. So I would encourage people who've got something to say and want to join up with others of like mind to use the digital opportunities, as we're trying to do this morning on this global call, so that we are in contact with each other if we are of like mind, or if we want to influence each other, and then put it out there to show the rest of the world that it is possible to do better than the current incumbent parties and governments are often doing.
Now, on the YouTube chat, I've got a comment here from Silence is Golden, but it sparked a little bit of a debate in the chat as well. So I might turn it into a question for you. Silence is Golden says, if the UK wants to be a world leader in AI, which requires incredible amounts of energy, the last thing you would want is to be a net importer of energy. We need nuclear and lots of it. So now this is a debate happening here in Australia as well about transitioning to nuclear energy. What are your views on nuclear power?
Well, I quite agree with the central proposition that we need more energy. I've always said that for industrial growth in particular, and now for AI digital growth, you need lots of available, reliable, relatively cheap energy. And the more you go on some of these net zero policies, the less that is going to be true. And for the United Kingdom situation, which I've been following very closely and very concerned about, I've strongly recommended that we put in some more gas power stations as quickly as possible. They are relatively cheap and can be built in relatively short order to well-known formulae, because then we could displace some of that import reliance that we have at the moment and make provision for all the extra power that the data centers, the AI revolution, and the other things we want to do is going to create. Now, on nuclear, I think there is now a cross-party consensus in the United Kingdom amongst the major parties that we do need more nuclear. But they are very reluctant to understand that the position is far more critical than that. It's not, wouldn't it be nice to have a bit of extra nuclear power? It is that the United Kingdom, on current plans, is going to close all but one of its nuclear power stations because they're quite elderly before 2030. And it only has one big new power station of a nuclear variety in build, and that may not be on stream before 2030. Even if it were, in 2030, the UK would be generating less nuclear power than it is today. So the UK both has to build a lot of nuclear power to replace the 4.8 gigawatts that are about to close in the next 3 or 4 years, and it needs to add a lot of nuclear power if it just wishes to maintain the percentage of nuclear, because we are assuming that we're going to have a more electrical future with far more demand from data centers and maybe from electric cars and heating systems and all the rest of it. The problem with nuclear has been that these are extremely expensive projects that take a very long time. With France and others, the UK has been trying to build extremely large single nuclear power stations, and these have taken more than 10 years to build and are often massively overrun on budget. And I think the answer is to go back to smaller nuclear sets on technologies that have been proven and have worked in the past, and they would be quicker to build and might be better in all sorts of ways. But the United Kingdom is still having a debate about what a smaller nuclear power station would look like and how quickly you could roll those out. I think the sooner the UK makes a decision on that, the better it's going to be, because it has this big replacement problem first and foremost.
Okay, I see our chairman, Lee Evans, with his hand up. Lee?
Yeah, as I'm not sure how long we've got Sir John for, I'd like to throw another one into the mix, if I may. And this is about democracy, which we've touched on, or Sir John has touched on so far in the first hour. And what we're picking up from our research globally is that this is a common thread around the world now, that there is a deep concern amongst ordinary people, not those who inhabit the corridors of power within each country, what we call in the UK the Westminster bubble. And no doubt you've got different names for this around the world, but certainly there seems to be a very common concern about this. I'd like to throw a question at Sir John regarding two things that he might want to comment on. Firstly, the quality of MPs that are now coming through the system. John himself has just stood down. In my view, putting political views to one side, he was an exceptional politician and representative of the people of Wokingham. He's now gone, and we're looking at the new intake of MP, huge new intake in the UK, and the quality so far seems to be a bit lacking. So my question is about that. How do we attract better quality MPs? And my second follow-up is about the lack of control of the civil service and its messaging. And I think this is absolutely key, because messages are not getting through from government via the civil service to the people. And we've got a current debate going on about misinformation and disinformation. We had Mark Zuckerberg giving testimony to Congress last week. And I can quote some examples. CPTPP, which is the Trans-Pacific deal, which the UK has just signed up to, or rather signed up to last year, and has just been approved by the 6th member, the majority, which means that we will be joining by the end of this year. It was Facts for EU that had to break that news to the world. The government didn't. They refused to say anything for 8 days about it. And therefore, the mainstream media didn't pick it up. It was only by us speaking to GB News, which is a relatively new news channel in the UK, that news has started to filter out. It is fabulous news. And I know that we had a question on email about whether John had views on that. So that's the third one, is CPTPP. The other thing I'd say is you try to contact, as we do on a regular basis, officials in government departments, and you cannot get transferred to the right person. Why is that? Because they're working from home and they're not on the same phone system. And so they take a message and you never get a phone call back. And my final example is this. We're here, Sir John is addressing a global audience today. What may not be understood around the world is that the United Kingdom is currently the fastest growing economy amongst the G7, the major G7 group of economies. The fastest growing in the first half of this year. Now, the reason I mention it is because people around the world are seeing negative publicity. The government hasn't shouted about this. We have, but the government hasn't. And so I wonder if any of those themes, either now or in the next 20 minutes, John could pick up on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee, and thank you for the mighty work you do. As you rightly say, you research it well, you understand what is going on, and you put out facts that the mainstream media find disobliging or don't want to know about. And of course, we've got a new government at the moment, so they are trying to rubbish the inheritance and legacy, so they have no interest in people knowing that by the time the Conservatives were thrown out of office, inflation was back at target of 2%, that we were the fastest growing economy in the first half of the year amongst the G7, that real incomes were rising strongly after a period when they had gone backwards. And so things had moved on to a much better inheritance, but Labour wants people to believe that the inheritance was dire. And they then immediately went off and offered a whole load of inflationary pay awards to the trade union public service workers, and then claimed that they had a big hole in their budget. Well, of course, they got a hole in their budget because they've just enacted a series of very inflationary pay awards, and they didn't bother to do what the previous government was trying to do, which was to get productivity and quality working practice improvements in order to help pay for pay rises, which in some cases were needed, but you needed to do it in a sensible and decent way. I don't want to pass comment on the new generation of MPs. They've just been elected by the electors. They've been selected by their parties. That was all a democratic process. I wish them well. I want my country to be well governed. I don't like some of the policies the government's following, so I won't be shy about criticising them, but I hope they work away. If you are collectively worried about the quality of MPs, then you can all take action, because you can join your local relevant party and be part of the selection process to get a different or better candidate, depending on your political views. I don't think there's a simple answer to how do you get better quality MPs. There's certainly some answers that the United Kingdom needs to think through on how the civil service can be more helpful when a government has identified a problem and wishes to do something about it. And there was no doubt that ministers in the last Conservative government wanted to end the small boat trade. Every day, Home Office ministers who came and went were very clear they wanted to do this, but the combined talent and resources of the civil service was unable to come up with a system for doing it, which seems a bit odd given this is talking about criminal activity. And there can be no doubt that the past Conservative government didn't want a big inflation, but the combined efforts of the advice of Treasury and Bank of England mandarins was to deliver us with a very unacceptable inflation. And surely there should be some reckoning for the very highly paid staff that delivered that, as well as an obviously dramatic reckoning for the senior politicians who allowed it to happen and presided over it. On a global basis, and I look at quite a number of the advanced countries around the world to see how they are getting on, there is this same gap in many places that we have in the United Kingdom between what the elite think about crucial issues and what an awful lot of other people think about them. And the two ones that are creating the biggest flare-ups, again, we're probably going to witness it in East Germany today, are the issues of mass migration, where on the whole, settled populations want a reasonable level of migration, not a very fast level of migration, and they want genuine refugees, and they're very worried about people claiming to be refugees when they're not. And on net zero, the public is willing to be environmentally friendly, but it doesn't think quite a lot of the very strong recommendations or requirements their governments are imposing on them make any sense, because they won't reduce world CO2, and they just make life more difficult. I mean, the hatred of the private car is very obvious in a lot of these policies, whereas most people either own a car or aspire to own their own car because it gives them freedom and flexibility to get to work, to get to the shops, to conduct their social life, to go to entertainment venues and so forth. And what is wrong with that? So I think the elite have to understand that the reason great parties in different Western democracies have been humiliated every time they have to face an election is they're on the wrong side of the arguments on net zero and on migration.
And Facts for EU have been breaking a lot of stories recently, and Lee has even been appearing on GB News, breaking a lot of issues. So, look, he's probably too humble to say this, but he does rely on donations. So please head to factsforeu.org and scroll down the bottom, hit the donate button, or subscribe. I mean, he's doing some great work, and some of these issues really do need to come to light, and Facts for EU are doing part of that. So if you can donate, please do so. But moving on, Steve Renton has another question in the chat. He says, RE the NHS, do you think one solution is to have some form of insurance scheme working alongside the existing state system?
I haven't proposed any reform to the financing of the NHS. I'm very conscious in the United Kingdom that people are very attached to the central principle, the main offer of the NHS, which is that you can get care and treatment when you need it at the point of need without having to pay, and that you pay through your general taxation. And I don't think the public is wanting a major change in that, and so I haven't been fueling that debate in any way. I think there are many other examples of extremely badly run public services where we can generate change and rely more on the customer money, as in the case of the railways, for example, where I think we should rely primarily on the fare payer rather than on massive subsidies for little used railway lines or very expensive railway lines, as with the new high-speed rail line, which the state is trying to put in, fully nationalised, which is massively over budget, and now won't even go to the places it was originally designed to go to, because we probably don't need the capacity and we can't afford to put it in.
Now, I want to ask you a question about the left infiltrating some institutions in our society. We know that they've got their claws into big business and also big tech, also big institutions like universities and some of the bureaucracy. Even here in Australia recently, only in the last week or two, our Liberal Party, again, the equivalent of your Conservative Party, failed to nominate for the upcoming council elections in a lot of councils. So Conservative-leaning voters are going to be walking into the polling booths with no one to vote for. Some people within that party are saying that the party has been overrun by the left, and this is part of the left's way of getting into to infiltrate right-leaning parties. Do you have a concern with that, not just in the UK but around the world, that the leftists are very good at getting into our institutions and wreaking havoc?
I'm certainly worried if there's no proper competition and choice. And one of the reasons the Conservative vote halved in the United Kingdom is a lot of former Conservative voters didn't think it was following recognisably small C Conservative policies anymore. And there are similar problems in other countries, including your own Australia. If you look at the United States of America, I mean, Trump has taken over the Republican Party on the opposite ticket, saying that he doesn't want people he calls rhinos, Republicans in name and only. He wants a proper Republican conservative agenda, and we'll see how he gets on. But he certainly was the only one who was able to command enough Republican support in order to get the nomination again. So this is a political battle in different countries being fought in different ways. But it is very important that sensible conservative views, I hope of the kind I've set out today, on how you get growth, greater freedom, more prosperity, more free enterprise, above all, wider ownership, are allowed a fair hearing. And it's even better when they find a politician and a party that will speak for them, as we did in the United Kingdom with Margaret Thatcher, for example. Anyway, I think probably we need to be putting this to a close. So
yes, look,
were there any more urgent questions?
We really appreciate your time tonight, Sir John. You're, as I said in the beginning, you're a fantastic intellect, and I have been blown away with how you've been able to answer every question over a lot of issues, and we much appreciate it here. I mean, we do need thought leaders like you in the world, not just in the UK, to get some views out. I see Lee with his hand up, so maybe Lee, you can cut in and wrap things up.
Actually, no. John, you're not getting away that easily. There's one topic that we haven't covered, and you are one of the few politicians that I know with direct experience of Brussels and the European Union. And I know this is of interest around the world, our relationship and what's happened since Brexit. But you've actually been there as single market minister. What do you think of the current government's approach, seemingly that they can do deals and align us more closely again, whatever that means, signing up to a new treaty and even a new form of defence compact? Do you think that they're being realistic or naive in the fact that the EU do not wish us well? They've proven that over the years since we voted to leave. And I wondered, based on your experience, if you could share your thoughts briefly with us on the European Union and what it represents. Thank you.
I think they're being very naive, or they're misleading us. The European Union has no wish to make concessions, as they see it, to the United Kingdom. And where the United Kingdom thinks it wants some improvement in the way the EU behaves towards us, it will come at a very high price. I think immediately the European Union sees the opportunity to reopen freedom of movement and say that we ought to take a lot more people from Europe, whether we wish to do so or not. They're opening it up for under 30s in first instance, but we know the direction of travel will be to get back to full open borders, because that would suit them greatly, given their own illegal migration problem. I'm sure they want more of our money again, because one of the big wins we had from Brexit was stopping to have to pay a very large sum of money for things we didn't particularly want or need. And they will obviously want to put us back under European laws, which we no longer are obeying, because there's now quite a lot of law which they've imposed on themselves since we left the European Union, which we haven't automatically imposed on the United Kingdom, and we're better off for that advance. So I would say to the government, don't be naive, don't think there's an easy deal to do. You notice that the government went to try and negotiate, first of all, with the Chancellor of Germany. Well, of course, that is insulting to the European Union and a pretty pointless exercise, because you need to negotiate with the 27, not with Germany. And the previous government tried some of that, trying to negotiate with larger states on the side, and the EU regarded that as very bad thing to do, and reinforce the message that they appointed a single negotiator on behalf of the 27, and you had always to deal with him if you wish to make progress. As single market minister, I found it was one of the worst jobs I ever had. I had to spend the whole time trying to fend off useless and damaging regulations and directives that they wanted to impose on us and others. And so it was a very negative job to have to do, because they didn't actually want freedom and free enterprise. They wanted regulated control. And the normal pattern was to take whatever the recipe or method of procedure was from one or more of the larger French and German companies, and then try and impose that on everybody else. So it was anti-innovation, it was anti-small business, it was anti-enterprise. And look at the results. We're living through this phenomenal digital revolution. And America is streets ahead, and America has created the mighty companies that have revolutionized social media and the machines we use for communicating and data and artificial intelligence. And the EU is left trying to regulate the American companies and getting a bit hissy because it doesn't like them very much. That is not the way to grow. That is not the way to be prosperous. So I would say to the United Kingdom government, you're negotiating with the wrong bloc about the wrong things in the wrong way. What you need to do to speed up British growth, my 5 points, and you can learn an awful lot from American digital.
Lee, I'll let you, if you got any more questions for Sir John?
I don't want to impose on Sir John's time much more on a Sunday morning. No, I think we can, if you're okay, John, unless we have any more questions from the floor, I'm happy to wrap this up with a few concluding thoughts. No, okay. So
I think we've probably exhausted people's interest, and there's plenty on my website if you want to learn more of my views. I do a story every day.
I was just about to say that as part of my summer. I'll start with one thing. I recalled when you were talking at the beginning, an old song, a popular song, 3 Steps to Heaven. Well, you've given us 5 steps to economic heaven, and you did so in a punchy, dramatic way that engaged the audience. So thank you for that. Picking up on a point that Stephen made very early on about how this contrasts, your approach and your delivery contrasts with some of the boring speeches we're getting from politicians, not only in the UK, but around the world. I have the misfortune to have to listen to some of them, and listening to you today was a breath of fresh air. So thank you very much for that. What I think you've done is stimulate us all in terms of ideas. This particular, well, before I go on to that, can I just say that I've been a reader of John's, well, it's almost becoming a memoir now, but his daily thoughts, which are fascinating to read. I can thoroughly recommend johnredwoodsdiary.com. Every day, just like Facts for You, he manages to produce something. He's possibly, well, he's one of 2 politicians that I know can speak to at about 5 o'clock in the morning. And we have a Prime Minister in the UK at the moment who apparently is going to knock off at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon and be unavailable until Monday morning. So thank you, Sir John, for continuing to entertain us via your own website. That's very important. And just on a general point, so that everybody knows, and this is important, I mentioned earlier about getting the message out there, which is something that we try on a daily basis to do. We are now having some success with that, but it is down to us all to get these messages out there, to get Sir John's thoughts out there. We think there's a ready audience. People just need to be made aware of it. So anything you can do to promote, repost either Sir John's work or Facts for EU's work or CIB UK's work or the excellent work that Stephen Tripp is doing in Australia with Commanding the Narrative. These are all important things. And today, Sir John, you've contributed to that global debate. I can tell you that we will be publishing this globally in edited form to take out some of the technical issues that we had earlier. And we'll also be producing, very critically, we'll be producing short sections, short segments on social media. And on social media, people will not listen to Sir John, fascinating though he may be. They will not listen to him for this length of time. What they will do is listen to short sound bites of 30, 45 seconds, something like that. And we aim to produce some clips from this that will get the message out further and maybe encourage some people to delve deeper. There is an appetite for knowledge. They're not getting it elsewhere. And John has this rare ability for, if I can say this without embarrassing you, John, for being one of the great intellectuals of the political world over the last 30 or 40 years. He has a great ability to be able to get the messages in a form that the public can understand. And it's our job to make sure that the public hears those messages. So, in conclusion, thank you very much, Sir John, for giving up your time on this Sunday morning. Thank you to everyone who has been watching and listening, either on Zoom or on YouTube. And I can confirm that when Sir John leaves us in a minute, we will be keeping this conversation going, and it'll be a more relaxed conversation. So if anyone wants to stay with us, then both Stephen and I will be more than happy to keep it going until the hour is up. So, John, back to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions. I'm very happy to participate in future such events. And I'd again like to say a really big thank you to our two hosts today who do magnificent work. And Lee, we really need you. We need that alternative approach to the media. And yes, I, like you, can work with GB News, and we need to expand the audience for those kind of channels, because people are being denied the truth about everything from net zero through to immigration.
Thank you. I think that concludes things for the public side of this. So my thanks once again, and on behalf of the three organisations that are co-producing, that's factsforeu.org, cibuk.org, and in Australia, commandingthenarrative.com. And to any other organisations listening that would like to participate in this, then you can contact me through the usual channels. We're more than happy to open this up more globally. So thank you very much. And that's all for now. And we'll be carrying on with a private chat later.
Well done. Thanks, Mick.